Welcome, everyone. So today I would like to address a very important topic, a topic that applies to multiple courses I teach. So I will attach this very lecture toward the end of the program for multiple classes. So you will see the link. And it's a topic that touches upon a variety of areas: academic, social, psychological, personal, even spiritual, from neuroscience to psychology, to medicine, to social policy, sociology, and a variety of other subjects. So I hope that you will enjoy the materials contained in this examination, and then you will be able to apply the knowledge acquired therein in all these areas. But I also want to mention this, that what I'm about to say today, I hope you will be able to utilize also in your personal life to verify the nature and the structure of certain claims. So without further ado, let's begin. So the topic is diversity, equity, inclusion, diversity, inclusion, equity, diversity, and the general training areas that DEI, EDI, DIE, depending which country and system we're talking about, are subject to and they analyze. The first thing I want to mention is this. In any type of analysis that I like to make, especially in an academic level, but this is my overall attitude in life, I want to deal with the argument itself. I want to deal with the topic and with the statement itself. I don't think it's a good idea, really in any area of life, to deal with the person making that statement. What does it mean? Well, it means two main things. The first thing is that if you want to argue in favor or in opposition to a certain argument, you should always be careful not to make the very famous ad hominem attack or any type of argument on the basis of fame, of authority, of title, etc., etc. You should evaluate the statement on its very merit, if that statement possesses one. Therefore, all the materials that I will analyze that will be filtered in order to make sure that no person, trainer, institution, or office is ever mentioned at any point in this lecture. So I will show you the materials that I will examine, but I will do my best to never mention any of the people that were making such statement, with a few exceptions. Those exceptions are, for instance, articles that are publicly available in libraries or on the internet with the author that wrote such articles. So in those cases, I'll be happy to provide the links and the direct description of the author because they chose to be public about such statement. I will not, however, share any names of any trainers or institutions I had the honor and privilege to work with. Now, I was very lucky because I had the chance to take a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion training as faculty, as researcher, as clinician. And so I had the chance to verify the intrinsic nature of claims made under the, you could say, the seal of universities, colleges, hospitals, higher education institution in general, governmental institutions, so on and so forth. I will never mention any of these institutions because, yet again, my focus here is to analyze what has been said, and even more importantly, what is expected to be said by faculties, teachers, professors, researchers, scientists, clinicians, and so on and so forth. It's a very important topic because there are many aspects of the way diversity, equity, inclusion is taught in this country, and I want to emphasize how this is specifically a problem in North America, and even more so in Canada and the United States, and to some lesser degree in the United Kingdom as well, some areas of the Commonwealth. But other areas in the world are already, how can I say, balanced in their approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, and already rejected many of these claims on the sheer basis of logic as well as of history, and permit the term common sense, kindness, and love. Unfortunately, what a lot of these trading are claiming to do goes in itself against the very ethical basis that they appear to support. So when we're talking about things such as appreciation, tolerance, non-judgmental kindness, one has to be extremely careful to separate the political, social, journalistic emphasis from what this statement actually says. So I would like to show you some of this material directly. So in a few minutes, you will see that on my screen and I will comment on them. I will also provide a link with the main article I wrote about this topic so that you can review that. And, if you so choose, I appreciate if you can provide me with your feedback, your comments or observation. And at the end of the video, we shall reconvene, so to speak, and I will conclude this talk. Now, let's begin from a broad philosophical assessment. One thing we could say about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that we could view them as values, and we could view them as values if we have the logical, let me use the term, safety attached to the fact that those claims, those values, might not be universal. And by universal, I don't mean universal in their application. We will have the chance to analyze whether that is the case or not, but universal as conditions sine qua non in Latin. Okay, so conditions that exist outside of other premises, whether there are absolute, whether diversity, equity, inclusion should be taken at face value, regardless of the way we apply them. So this is one topic. The other topic would be the analysis of the claim that is related to the theoretical and the practical. What do we mean by theoretical and practical? We mean intent on one side, and we mean outcome on the other side. We mean thought on one side and response on the other side. And whether one justifies the other, either logically in a sequential manner or in an ethical manner. So we will talk that about in a few minutes. Now, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Few things before we analyze that. Why would diversity be a good value? Well, nobody would claim that preventing diversity as a moral wrong is such a good idea. After all, we are growing as people if we meet someone who is different from us, who is diverse from us. And I want to stress this important element here. In many languages, being diverse or being different actually tend to mean the very same thing. Those two terms are pretty much synonyms. And if you are interested in the etymology of each term, I'll be happy to provide more links to that. But the idea is there is something that separates us from the rest. Now, to some extent, these two terms are connected to terms such as sacred, okay? So sacred or saint, you could say, as separate from the norm, which means that something that is outside of the norm, it's not normal, or it's not normal in the same way as the name says, the norm requires. Now, this is a specifically mathematical term, or rather specifically mathematical usage of the term. This does not advocate for clarity any usage of abnormal or you are not normal in any offensive way. Now, whether someone has the logical right, so to speak, to feel offended about the use of this term, this is also something that we analyze. So why would diversity be a absolute term? Well, being diverse also means to recognize what is different from us. And so to some extent, it's a really good thing. And it's something that we want to make sure we recognize in the context of the area we're talking about. So for instance, there are situations that are less diverse by their very nature. It does not mean that those situations, those areas, are intrinsically wrong or evil. In fact, making that statement would be the obvious reliance on a higher moral or ethical standard. To me, if something is wrong, is predicated upon the recognition of something absolute in regard to that very statement of right or wrong. For instance, you might have situations that are less diverse by the very nature. For instance, you might find that in a public hospital, you will find more physicians and nurses. You might find less engineers walking around the area, walking around the unit, for instance. You might find some actual application of engineering in EHR, computer science applied to electronic health records in the hospital. So you might find some engineers working in IT. But to claim that the very fact that there are less engineers in a public hospital in comparison to physicians and nurses, and this is itself predicated upon hatred, for instance, it's absolute nonsense. There is a reason why we will find more physicians and nurses in the hospital. And the reason is it is a hospital. So this is just an example, okay, of the way we should view diversity. Now, of course, if there is a prevention of diversity on the basis of race, for instance, then in itself is also wrong. However, I also want to stress out that there are situations where the very definition of what constitutes diversity is really, in itself, pun intended, diverse. For instance, what constitutes citizenship, what constitutes nationhood, nationality can vary. To give you a brief examples, in the European Union, or by extension in Europe in general, whether those countries are part of the EU or not, certain countries have, so to speak, the proclivity, the tendency to use one type of interpretation of the law, and others do have another interpretation. This is not because they're trying to bend the rules, but because their view on a specific aspect of the law is very diverse. So you might have law by blood, use sanguinis, according to which you are a part of that country, for instance. If your blood, your DNA, your genetic heritage is part of that country, regardless if you were born in that country, okay? So what matters is your heritage, not where you were born. And other countries instead have the law by soil, by earth, the use solid. So you become a citizen of that country, you become part of that nation if you were born in that nation, regardless if your parents or grandparents were born elsewhere. Okay? This is not a lecture in which I analyze the juxtaposition between ius solis and ius sanguinis, but I just want to mention that there are situations where certain claims cannot be viewed as universally valid. So this is just an intro to diversity. What about equity? Same thing. When we think about equity, and at this stage, I will not separate equality and equity, okay? I will do that later. And there is a reason why I want to do this later, because I want to just give you an overall view. So if by equity / equality at this stage permit me to put them together without any logical care for the difference between opportunity and outcomes, okay? I will merge everything together. So if a society is equitable, then we should view everyone with the same opportunities to reach, for instance, a certain level of education. I was born in Europe, and I'm a very big fan of publicly funded education. I think that paying for colleges and universities the way we pay them in the United States, it's absolutely, appalling, especially in regard to what happened in the last 10, 15 years. So I do believe that education for a very big part, should be publicly funded, and so that anyone could afford to go to elementary, middle school, high school, and college for, if not completely for free, for a very, very low tuition. So in that sense, yes, we are all equal under the law, absolutely. However, equality of outcomes is a completely different thing. Just because we can all reach, I don't know, third grade middle school, it does not mean, or eighth grade as most of the United States system calls it, and we can go to high school, or if you're in Europe, you can go ahead and pass the high school and go to what we call the lyceum and lyceums, then you cannot expect to have the same grades as the person next to you. This has nothing to do with being canceled or being shunned or being, I don't know, put in a position where you cannot afford education. It's simply that we are different in a variety of ways. And it's again to do with diverse. And thankfully, we are different. And there are some of us that have differences in education because we chose to have different education, or because we were not able to continue in a certain academic path. We have differences in appearance, in height, in weight, in a variety of things, okay? And these are not connected to what some elements of certain DI training want us to be, which is hatred or intolerance. It's just the nature of things. And before you might think that by nature I used a biologistic, not biology, but biologistic point of view, I really want you to think about why it's so wrong to use biology and science in addressing certain issues, okay? Because another claim of certain DEI training is that the very scientific nature of our education, and I want to mention biology, but even more so math, in itself is a negative factor. I even heard that mathematics is a remnant of a European colonialist attitude. Well, to make the claim that mathematics is a remnant of European colonialism is, first of all, completely ignorant of history, especially of Persian history, the Islamic mathematical tradition, the Indian academic tradition, and so it just does not make sense whatsoever. But it's also very silly to claim that certain things that we can teach our children in themselves should prevent other children to be so successful. So this is just a beginning of our analysis on equity. What about inclusion? Why is being inclusive a good thing? Well, we have to see whether the claims sustains its logical examination. For instance, think about what it means to be included in something, in a system, okay? A group of friends, a family, a country. Well, being included, or rather wanting to be included, also is predicated upon the fact that this institution, this group of people, is easily recognized as in itself structured and different from us. Example, the reason why we have exams and tests to enter, for instance, a higher academic institution is because we want to be included in something bigger than us, not because we're not worthy. And this has to do with a very different analysis of what the natural moral law, one could say, and the fact that I believe that we are all worthy as human beings by the very fact that we are indeed human beings. And there is a theological, spiritual, religious element to it. So your title in that sense does not really matter in terms of how worthy you're a person. But if you want to be a student in a certain higher level institution and you need to pass a test, you cannot claim this institution is discriminating against you if the test has been found to be applicable to a variety of individuals in the same manner. And in that sense, we should have a conversation about the statistical analysis, the study design of such tests, and whether they in themselves are applicable on a statistical and epidemiological, and whether their validity, internal validity, for instance, is applicable or not. But that's a conversation we'll have on statistics, and I have a few lectures that analyze the study design of such tests, specifically in regard to SAT score, GREs, the G factor, IQ, so on and so forth. But the very fact that you can be included also means that you could be excluded. Now, schools and university aside, the same thing can be said about being included, for instance, in a country you want to become a citizen of. If the country has no self-definition, if the country has no borders, for instance, if the country has no specific set of laws, then the reason why you might want to enter and become a citizen of the country becomes nihil. It's completely irrelevant because it's not a country anymore. And again, this is not a conversation on specific policies. We're talking about the logic predicated upon the usage of the term being inclusive. How about a family? Would it be intolerant to think that as a father, I'm using that term because I am one, I should care first and foremost about my children before I care about children of someone else's family? Is that in itself hateful? If, for instance, I have to work and I need to stop working because one of my children is getting sick, should I take care of my child first, or should I make a few phone calls to see if someone else is sick in the neighborhood? I think we should all agree that the primary response, both in a sequential, logical, as well as a moral sense, is you need to take care of your children first. Now, this does not mean whatsoever you should discriminate between children. For instance, you may have some biological children, you may have some children that are adopted, and you put the biological children on a higher moral standard. That's not what being inclusive means. But if you want to talk about adoption, one should also be extremely careful in understanding the background of the child you are adopting. It does not make you more discriminating in an evil sense to try to figure out the possible traumas, for instance, that a child you adopted might have encountered before you adopted this child. What about a playground? Should children be so inclusive that they are forced to play with everyone, despite the fact that some children might be behaving toward them in a very confrontational, hateful, and perhaps bully-like way? Well, being inclusive also means being selective. So we see how these three terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion, do not contain in themselves a higher moral standard. They are predicated upon other ethical values. So in the next section of this brief lecture, we will examine a training, a diversity, equity, inclusion training that contemporary university, college, institution offer to faculty, and we'll examine those claims and we will try to see if they are logically consistent and whether they are morally and ethically good. Let's start with week 2. That was the week 2 of our training. We were being asked to read this article about POGM, people of the global majority. So I'll read my reply to this week and the material contained therein. I will read from the assignment, and some of this is part of the articles that I mentioned earlier. So there might be some mismatch between what you can see on your screen and what I'm saying, because I'd like to elaborate on certain aspects. All right, so this week we have been asked to work with a partner or triad to research an assigned topic related to the experience or experiences of the people of the global majority. I have carefully read and watched all the materials provided in week 1 and 2, but in this examination we mainly focus on the article by Britt Hawthorne in the link above. Yes, these articles might not be as nonsensical, poorly written, and simply below academic, logical, and ethical standards as the ones by, let's say, Robin DiAngelo or Ibram X. Kendi, but it's appalling nonetheless. Within a few seconds, the reader could be convinced that this is indeed a piece of hateful racism, hate, unfairness, injustice, and evil. However, one should always be kind to any writer, especially given that one could not possibly know the reason behind this behavior. We could hypothesize that the author has suffered immensely, and the resulting grief and loss from the horrible events she suffered might have caused such a vitriolic narrative.
I happen to be a clinical psychologist, so I purposely refrain from engaging this type of analysis, psychoanalysis, etc., because I simply don't know anything about the author, and I believe it would be unfair and possibly unscientific to make any diagnostic claims without proper clinical interaction and observation. Therefore, rather than examining the processes which might underlie the author's writing, I will directly examine what she wrote. This is, after all, the recommended empirical evidence one ought to seek in applying the scientific method. So, let's begin. As I previously mentioned, it only takes a few seconds to realize how bad this article is. The very first sentence is, if you were to ask a child, are there more white people or people of color in the world? Almost all children would say white people. We could already argue that, according to some ill informed critics, this sentence could already be considered hateful speech, as it targets, minimizes, and finally excludes a group of people on the basis of their skin color. But we will not do this. After all, this will be the exact same tactic that white supremacists like the Ku Klux Klan utilize to defend themselves. At least that's what they're claimed in their twisted conspiracy theory and hate. They defend themselves against the other groups. Thus, we will give the author the benefit of the doubt that she meant well and that she did not want to teach children hate. I don't only believe this is indeed the best approach, both the scientific evidence and the parenting common sense tell us that it is. In other words, giving someone the benefit of the doubt is epistemologically equivalent to putting intent over impact. We teach our children kindness and forgiveness. We don't teach them preemptive hatred. Of course, pun intended. That is precisely why, if there is evidence of harm being done, if the person committing the harm is unaware, we do our best to make her aware, and if she apologizes, we forgive her. In fact, from a moral standpoint, I would argue that we should always forgive, even if the person is not apologizing, and even when there is evidence of physical harm being committed. By the way, this is not just me. This claim about forgiveness is derived from a variety of traditions, possibly picking with the moral guidance found, such as in the Roman Virtus, the Christian 7 times 7, the Kafara in Islam, etc., etc. Now, this is due to the obvious reason that forgiving heals our very self first, and then it stops breeding resentment. This applies not only to the individual, I would argue, but to communities as a whole system, as whole systems, plural. If this does not happen, what some call affirmative action really means revenge. And I don't advocate for revenge ever. Not with my kids, not with my students, not with my patients, my co-researchers, my friends. I don't advocate for revenge with anybody. Certainly, we could argue that this moral guidance might be perceived as just, quote unquote, a personal preference, and that there are not universal truths. I'll be more than happy to argue against this nonsensical take on reality of the same worth and value as the philosophy one can find on Facebook or Wikipedia, but A, I don't want to offend the reader's intelligence, and B, I promise to stick to the blog article above. Therefore, a possible criticism to the application of the moral guidance expressed above is that it might apply to the individual but not to society as a whole. Of course, this perspective is easily rebutted by the slightest knowledge of history, but if we want to stick to logic, it is useful to point out that, quote, affirmative action benefits those who were not injured and injures those who have not benefited. David Berlinski in his wonderful 2019 book, link below. And that it might be best to keep focusing on the individual intent rather than blaming entire groups of people. Now, this entire group of people, of course, are the whites, which of course are written in lowercase letter. Notice the difference with people of color in the article by Hawthorne. So rather than blaming entire groups of people to reestablish this, again, ill-perceived notion of justice. This will be the same as prescribing the same diabetes medications to perfectly healthy individuals, or even worse, prescribing an antipsychotic to someone suffering from a terrible depressive state, or an antidepressant to someone amid psychosis. This is not only immoral, but also anti-scientific and extremely dangerous. Quote again by Berlinski: rights are general, remedies are not. See, we already spent 2 pages on the first sentence of the article and we didn't even scratch the surface. Yes, we still need to be kind. We are giving the author the benefit of the doubt. In fact, this attitude might even be pleasing to author, assuming that she valued impact over intent. Assuming that the impact here is the thing she wrote and the intent, the psychological reason why she did it. In my view, this would be a stretch, as the scope of this analysis is primarily to show the inconsistencies of what she writes, and only then claiming that what she wrote could have a detrimental impact. In other words, we first ought to point out the fallacy, the ignorance, perhaps the stupidity of the claims, and then, if all of these are indeed confirmed, we might venture into demonstrating that believing in all of these has a very negative impact on the people who are reading this nonsense. Especially, I would argue, the ones not equipped with not enough logical acumen to take them apart or not enough experience to see the possible future harm. Although this stance ought to be substantiated, otherwise it would be another conspiracy theory, or simply because the reader deep inside might feel that what Hawthorne writes is indeed problematic, but does not dare to speak up in fear of being judged to be on the wrong side of history, quote unquote, which again might be presupposing the assumption that human morality proceeds in linear fashion, thanks to the logical nonsense of the French Revolution and the misplaced beliefs of the age of quote unquote enlightenment. And the current critical race theory or critical social justice is morally superior to what our grandmothers and great grandmother taught us. I beg to differ, but one should know what our children have been taught in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, and things are getting worse. Anyway, going back to the articles, the very claim that, quote, people of color, capitalized, and white people should be viewed as 2 different groups. Whether a person will judge the essential nature of the color white differently, whether this person is more a fan of, let's say, Newtonian physics, or perhaps due to experience in a Waldorf schools more sympathetic to Goethean physics, neither would argue that white is not a color. Claim that whites are not people of color would be exclusionary, racist, fact, and possibly harmful speculation. However, one could argue that those groups should be separated on the ground that they were on opposite sides in the past. This again shows a lack of knowledge of the basic facts of history. To see how this happens, let us continue with the next paragraph. Quote, people of the global majority, POGM, refer to black people, indigenous people, brown people, Latinx people, with X, particularly indigenous and Afro-Latinos, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, the Inuit communities, Alaska Natives, Native Americans, Arabs, Western Asians, Middle Eastern with dark skin, North Africans, Southeast Asians, South Asians, East Asians, Africans with dark skin, and biracial and multiracial people who are mixed with one or more of the above, and people and groups who can't access white privilege. There is so much to unpack here that I want to offer both a logical examination of the claim and a biased perspective. Biased because it is based on my own experience and the experience of my family. However, I would show how one could utilize a deductive or inductive analysis and reach the exact same conclusion. I will just use one example to make the point. Otherwise, this examination will be too long for this assignment. People of the global majority refers to black people, indigenous people, brown people, Latinx people, particularly indigenous and Afro-Latinos. I honestly do not know this very statement cannot be but racist. I am from South Tyrol. My family is from South Tyrol. My ancestors are from South Tyrol. We are the heirs and the victims of the tragedy of World War II, especially because the ethno-geographic position South Tyrol found itself in. We were squeezed between the quote-unquote Latino supremacy of Mussolini and the Germano supremacy of Hitler. Fascists believed in the intrinsic superiority of the Latino people, Hitler in the Germano people. Now, I will see here how to separate the term Latines, Latin, Latino, and Germanic, German, Germano, but we shall continue for now. The war between Nazis and fascists in the area started long before World War II, but became extremely violent during the opzione, the option period. I'll be happy to provide more evidence of what many people don't know. Most people think that the Nazis and fascists are one and the same and completely ignore history. But I will concentrate on that interesting fact of history in another video. But in any case, to sum up, fascists were used to say nonsensical things such as Latin America is perpetrating cultural appropriation against us because they stole the term Latin. The original Latino people were from the Latium, Lazio in Italy. But at the same time, they were supporting dictators who fully embody the purity of Latinos against the opposition, right? Because after all, it's an extension of the Roman Empire, the one they wanted to rebuild, right? So the Roman, Italian, Italic, Latino, Latin Empire. Example of this were and are still found not only in Europe. Think about Franco, the Franco regime in Spain, although that is really not the same as Italian fascism, which was an offspring, one could say, of this atheistic socialism versus the Spanish dictatorship had a strong Catholic component to it. It's definitely not atheistic. But in any case, this was also found throughout America. However, for all the stupidity and evil, at least the fascists knew their geography. They always said, and everybody says, that America is a continent, not a country. And Latin America extends from North America. Of course, Quebec is Francophone and therefore Latin, Italic speaking. And Mexico is also North American, also Italic, also Latin and Spanish speaking, all the way to South America. And in fact, the Italic languages are the predominant language throughout America. Of note, to this day, our schools and children need to study the three biggest American cities. No mention of the USA when talking about the biggest American cities. So anytime you hear this merging of proto-crypto-fascist Christian American nationalism, think of what term we use, okay? Anyway, to go back to World War II, the fascists pushed even the notion that there is only one America, and this is Latin America, Latin first. Now, this is not true for every fascist, and it's true that a lot of Latin, Italic, Roman nationalists will still say that, right? But obviously, this put the fascists in opposition to the Nazis as they sought to demonstrate their Germanic Aryan superiority, first against or in opposition to the Italian one or Italic one, and then, of course, because of what happened in history, those two merge. They could say, like, well, yes, Quebec is indeed Latin America, and so it is Nouveau-France all the way to Louisiana. This was also to deny the claim that some fascists made that Vermont was Latin America as well, given that the state heritage, right? But after all, the Francophones are heirs of the Franks, and the Franks were Germanic people who simply adopted the Latin language, custom, culture, and religion. This is extremely important if you heard the news, for instance, in regard to the Abenaki heritage and the problem with the Canadian Abenakis claim that the Vermont Abenakis are pretendians. Pretendians is this term utilized when a person not of a native heritage pretends to be a Native American. And this is a problem for two main reasons. One is that I don't know anything, or let me say this, I don't know enough about Vermont Abenakis or Abenakis in general to make any claims in that regard. I am certainly not Abenaki myself. I don't have any heritage, nor anthropological or historical training in that. But for a professor to claim that biology plays a role in claiming a genetic heritage makes total sense to me. And if someone were to say, I just feel something, I just feel native, therefore I'm native, this is nonsensical as the claims in transgender ideology about identity. I argued that in a separate lecture series. That's the first problem, that there is a complete rejection of science and biology. The second problem is that one could make the case that having this strong inclination to feel special is something that we all experience as human beings. You want to feel special, you want to be loved, and sometimes that takes the shape of wanting to be slightly separate from someone else. For instance, one could be quote unquote proud of their, I don't know, Irish, African American, Italian, German heritage, being in the United States. Nothing wrong with that. And someone could claim to have a native heritage and feel proud about it. Nothing wrong with that. Now, of course, if you were not any of this, and you feel a sense of inferiority and an inferiority complex because you're just a white European, nothing special about it, nothing special about you, in fact, this in itself is a problem of the outcome of certain type of politics, ideology, and certain diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Anyway, to go back to this analogy of World War II and the Nazis and the fascists, proto-fascists, proto-Nazis. So this created the first tension between essentialists, also called biologists, and culturalists or ethnicists. The Nazi believed that ethnicity was primarily defined by genetic makeup, while the fascists by culture and language. So this is what we just said. You cannot claim to be something you're not. Biology plays a role, but when we use biology to determine IQ levels or superiority, you really find yourself in an anti-scientific conspiracy theory background. And here we were in South Tyrol, split between the Germanic or Latin choice. And I do remember how my grandparents were telling me how the Ahnenerbe, if you don't know what the Ahnenerbe, I really encourage you to research it, perhaps not on the internet, but in real libraries. The Ahnenerbes were always roaming the towns, measuring their skulls, eyes, and necks to investigate the racial purity. If you think about the nonsensical pseudoscientific claims of the Nazi science, you know what we're talking about here, and not just physiognomy/physiognomics, but this claim of pseudo neuroscience, and I have a lecture on that as well. What they were looking particularly was a small triangular bump in the back of the neck, roughly below the cerebellar area, which was indicative of the purest Aryan blood. Not surprisingly, they found this bump in most of the local heads. I have one myself, and so do my children. And it doesn't really mean anything. Their pseudoscientific theory, mostly based on phrenology by Gall and physiognomy by Lombroso, made us decide that the South Tyrolians were the purest German stock, and thus decided to resettle all of us to purify the lowest European bloodline, it as the Slavic, starting from Crimea. The fact that I, a Tyrolean, ended up marrying a person whose heritage is Slavic is just the perfect irony. Anyway, the forced resettlement was organized by the Nazi Generalkommissar for the Crimea, Alfred Frauenfeld. The fascists opposed the idea and sought to demonstrate that all Tyroleans were indeed pure Latinos or Latins or Latini, thus direct descendants of the Latinos, Latini, etc., who came from the Latium, the Lazio, and escaped the invasion of the Germanic tribes, mostly Langobards, Bajuwars, Danes, Cimbers from Jutland, etc., etc., and found refuge in the highest valleys after the sack of Rome. Modern ethnographic and genetic research concludes that yes, indeed, we are both. And one could argue that this was before we split, right, as people. More specifically, the Latins and the German stock was the same Indo-European stock who came to Europe around 5,600 years ago, give or take, merging with the Hallstatt culture autochthonous to the area. The oldest European mummy is indeed South Tyrolian. In other words, the bloodline is neither and both, because the separation happened thousands of years later. And as far as language and culture goes, yes, we will still speak the ancient Latino language of the era, called Ladin in Tyrol, Romansch in Switzerland. And, they're not exactly the same. There's Ladin Dolomitan, there's a colony in Friulan, in Furlan, in Friul, etc., etc. But of course, in Tyrol, we also speak German and Italian. But the Ladin identity is one that is connected to the heirs of the land. And yes, many studies were conducted in this area, and virtually everyone's defended the right to utilize proper Latin grammar, right? Latin, Italian, Latin. And so using Latins, for instance, is nonsense, and it's considered cultural imperialism from the USA to add the X to remove feminine and masculine. And there are many initiatives promoted by the local Tyrolean government to defend the rights of minorities in the area, from the ethnic music and dance to defense of the ancient language to politics. So let's not add an X where we don't want it. And by we, I mean Latin culture in this extension. So to claim it, you can do whatever you want, but to claim that it's hateful and we want to preserve that, it is in itself cultural imperialism. The opposite is true. Okay. Of course, there are critics with virtually no linguistic knowledge or even worse, historical understanding that focus on that all this focus on minority and defines of culture is just a heritage of the horrors of World War II. Now, extremes are found everywhere. So some of these extremes might be true, all right? So what we said about earlier about the jus sanguinis and jus soli is still the case. For instance, about half of the country in the EU adopt a jus sanguinis framework, while the other half the jus solis. In the context of South Tyrol, we have the department of the government that specializes in the law of proports. Again, if you don't know what that is, I encourage you to research that. And these attempts to fight against this ethno-cultural mix of the population to maintain a complete distinct areas, linguistically speaking. Okay. Now, I don't agree with the way the law is applied and even the way the law is written. But the reason why there is a separation is to make sure that one can learn a proper German language, a proper Italian language, and a proper Latin language. Okay. In practice, when we speak, we mix and match those three all the time, and we have tons of different dialects. But if we want to speak to someone in Italy, in Switzerland, in Malta, in Germany, in Liechtenstein, etc., or in Friul, if you want to use that as an example, we should be able to use proper language and make ourselves understood with correct grammar. So let's get rid of all this fake notion of exclusion. So this is just an example, and the same can be said about the term Oriental. I addressed that many times in the past, but just because we're talking about World War II and we talked about Germany and Italy, Japan will be the third main Axis power. So the term Oriental, it's not offensive at all if you use that properly. For instance, in Italian, since we talked about Italian last. So una persona orientale, or una persona orientale, if you want to use the Latin variation, is the proper ways to refer to a person, an Oriental person, not an Asian person. Okay, so and this is quite interesting because there is a lot of layers to interpret that, and it's silly to want to merge everything and impose what happened in one country and export that judgment into another country. I really encourage you to see a video in this regard. And by the way, there are counterfactual multiple conspiracy theories. If you think about the one about the Pan-European Union or Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi, and the Habsburg, you find all sorts of conspiracy theory, but we prefer to stick to science and facts. All right, and an example of this was like blaming people for crimes of the past. Okay, for instance, blaming all Muslims, Palestinians included, okay, for the crimes that Mussolini perpetrated in World War II, because Mussolini was the protector of Islam. It was carrying the sword of Islam. Well, that would not make sense, right? So should one discredit Hinduism, Buddhism, and even historical figures in that era because of what happened in the Indian Legion. Okay, now we want to make sure to address historical facts, for instance, about Gandhi in the proper way, but I really encourage you to study history and not base all your judgment on what you find on Facebook, on TikTok, Twitter, any social media, or unfortunately this type of diversity and inclusion training. Other nonsense. This is precisely why statements such as the one presented in the article by Hawthorne, how people of the global majority disrupt white supremacy culture, is inconsistent, fallacious, and hateful. It promotes ignorance, division, hatred, and the false claim that it purports to defend those very values it is clearly standing in strong opposition to. Now, from a clinical perspective, strongly corroborated by scientific evidence, it is not too difficult to spot elements of persecutory cognitive distortions in statements such as growing up in a white supremacist culture can make it exceedingly difficult to see the white supremacy that surrounds us. We used to treat this clinically. If one sees horror and evil all around the world, one might be tempted, that is, after all, both a sin and a cognitive distortion, to actually find injustices everywhere. In science, we call this confirmation bias, and both the right-wingers and the left-wingers are victims of it. A much better quote would be the sentence that in order to find peace inside, it is easier to put on shoes than to cover the entire surface of the world with rags. Now, this was attributed to many writers, from Rumi to Shantideva to Trungpa to Franklin to Gibran, etc., etc. Notice that this position does not advocate ignoring injustices. Quite the contrary. It attempts to solve injustices by looking at oneself first. It is a perennial, why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eyes but not notice the beam in your own eye? Matthew 7:3. But of course, quoting from Jesus is indeed an act of white supremacy. Never mind that the area where Christianity originated is not England, the US, or Fennoscandia. How about the idea that yes, the world is a valley of tears and that we are in this world but not of this world? Shouldn't we use a more open-minded and open-hearted approach to our human experience? The author of the article does not seem to think so. She might even claim that to consider MFE, merit, fairness, and equality, is a much better option than DI is in itself white supremacy. I wonder what an African Latino like Scipione would have thought of the current state of affairs. Let us be sure, saying that people of ethnicities may not fully embrace the people of color is not only stupid, it is not true. And universal truth does indeed exist. If any truth will be true, if it is true to the person believing it, it is not too difficult to see how this statement is in itself inconsistent. In fact, the statement, there are no universal truth, brands itself as a truth everyone should believe in. Ha! The irony. This is precisely my point. During the last meeting as part of this training, it was claimed that, direct quote, we start from the assumption that it is not a question whether a specific place is racist, but we focus on how and whether it manifests itself. How about evidence? How about having a debate, better a dialogue or discussion where we examine the evidence of it? And even if we were, hypothetically speaking, to assume that this specific place in the world is indeed racist, this claim begs the question, racist in comparison to what? If one were to reply in comparison to Nazi Germany or the Confederate South of the US, this would be a very poor argument. You would be claiming that a moral judgment is better simply because it does not end in a Nazi-like Holocaust. If by saying this place is racist, the claim includes statements such as this place is racist because variable A1, everyone who lives here is mostly white, and variable A2, the majority of white people is racist, the person making this claim may have to learn some history. Okay? If the comparison is with the Nazi, the claim falls apart. Nazi ideology was amongst the most horrifying ideology in human histories. And yet, most of the people they killed were actually fair skins. Okay? So, to which an all-informed person might reply, this is nonsense. That was just a question, white against white, but history clearly shows that for the most part, whites abused and enslaved brown and black people. Really? How about the Slavs in the Balkans during the Ottoman domination? How about the Latini, the Italic people during the Arab Caliphate? How about the Indo-Europeans during the Qing domination? How about the Ugro-Finnic tribe during the Tatar and Mongol invasion? Are Sami not tribal and ethnic enough to be considered victims? One ought to look at the eugenic policies of Sweden until the late 70s to be proven wrong. For instance, Vermont experienced some of the very same issues. Look at the University of Vermont in that regard, in regard to eugenics. In many cases, horrors were perpetrated by separating people on the basis of color, what Hawthorne clearly advocates for, or religion. The vast majority of the local Abenaki population, to go back to what we said earlier, in Quebec as well as here, converted to Catholicism. Before one is to label Catholicism white supremacy, one ought to study the history of the quote-unquote WASP persecution against Catholics, which will include French, Irish, Abenaki, Italian, Hispanic, etc., etc. Finally, just for this specific article, statement like, while it is everyone's responsibility to keep up with and educate themselves about the new terminology, have grace with people who have not caught up yet, so to speak, are abhorrent. This could be something that Goebbels could have used in his speech. Actually, let me correct what I just said. Scientific studies already have proven that this type of ideology, the one embraced by articles such as the one by Hawthorne, present the very same presupposition as Nazi Germany. Not like, sort of, but the exact same words.
Well, thank you very much for your attention. This has been a very, very important topic to discuss. I hope I give you the chance, the opportunity to interact with some of those logical processes that we covered today, and also perhaps give you the opportunity to make informed choices about the type of education that you are going to embrace, either as a student or a faculty member, or by extension as researchers, scientists, clinicians, public policy makers, politicians, sociologists, so on and so forth. That, of course, includes first and foremost parents. Thank you again. If you have questions or comments, feel free to contact me either here in this video below, or you can certainly send me an email. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.